and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Burges Watson. Coming up today, President Trump says the US-Israeli attack on Iran is going substantially ahead of schedule, but warns that it could last longer than a month. We'll be asking, what is the US strategy and what sort of a timeline are we looking at here? And as Tehran retaliates with ongoing strikes targeting US interests and allies across the Gulf, Hezbollah draws Lebanon into the conflict after launching rocket attacks on Israel. And a not-so-special relationship. President Trump says relations between the US and the UK aren't like they used to be. This in the context of the US-Israeli strikes on Iran. We ask, can that relationship be patched up? Hello and welcome to the programme. On this day 4 of the US-Israel war on Iran, we continue our special coverage, bringing you the latest updates from across the region. Well, as tensions rise, the US President Donald Trump said that Iran's military power has effectively been neutralised. He said Iran wants negotiations, but he said that it's already too late for that. In a posting on Truth Social, President Trump said that Iran's air defences, air force, navy and leadership are gone. Well, American citizens in several Arab countries have been warned and urged to evacuate immediately. That's despite the fact that there are widespread airline closures. Well, this comes as Iran continues to strike US military targets in the Gulf, including a drone attack resulting in a limited fire and some material damage at the US embassy in Riyadh. Well, President Donald Trump told CNN that the, quote, biggest surprise of the war so far has been Iran's attacks against Arab countries in the region. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the US has a plan in place to destroy Iran's ballistic missile capabilities and take out key elements of its navy.
The United States is conducting an operation to eliminate the threat of Iran's short-range ballistic missiles and the threat posed by their navy. Why does Iran want that ballistic missile capability? What they are trying to do and have been trying to do for a very long time is build a conventional weapons capability as a shield where they can hide behind, meaning there would come a point where they have so many conventional missiles, so many drones, and it can inflict so much damage that no one can do anything about their nuclear program. Obviously, markets are going to be reacting to news about what's happening. And again, a reminder, think about it, okay? This terroristic regime led by radical clerics has the ability, potentially, to shut off 20% of global energy. That's the kind of leverage they have because of their Navy. We're going to destroy their Navy. But there is a plan in place. We anticipated this could be an issue.
We're joined now by Marc Gustafson, who is a former head of the White House Situation Room and former Chief of Intelligence for the National Security Council. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Arabiya English. This conflict is now in its 4th day. We've heard from the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saying the US is hitting Iran, quote, surgically, overwhelmingly and unapologetically. In your view, what's actually been achieved militarily so far?
I think the region is in a very precarious position right now. The U.S. and Israel have struck thousands of targets across the Iranian territory. I think they're focusing right now on striking ballistic missile facilities, storage areas, and launchers to try and eliminate the threat to Gulf countries and to Israel as quickly as possible. So my hunch is that over the next few days, they're going to be focusing entirely on going after these missiles and drone facilities to eliminate the threats to all of the nearby countries.
Yeah, I mean, there are some pundits out there and there are some analysts, military analysts that you hear on the television channels saying that there is a lack of coherent strategy here. What do you say to that?
The military, the U.S. military is good at putting together strategies, so I don't think they're going to go in and just fire off at whatever they want to, based on in the moment. I think that they came in with a plan. They probably gamed this out for weeks in advance. They looked at a target deck and they tried to figure out where the biggest threats were to U.S. forces, but also to others in the region, and they're executing on that day by day. Obviously, they'll have to change as the situation changes. I think there will probably a lot more drone strikes and missile strikes against nearby Gulf states than they expected. And that's something they're going to have to adjust to on the fly. I think right now what we're seeing is the conflict has shifted from concerns about Israel's security to concerns about the Gulf state security and the U.S. embassies and U.S. forces in the immediate vicinity of Iran. That shift has been happening over the last couple of days. The biggest indicator of that shift was when the U.S. military decided to send the aircraft carrier, the USS Ford, that was off the coast of Israel to the Persian Gulf. And it's on the way now. It should be arriving soon. I think they need that reinforcement and the extra firepower that comes with it.
Okay. I mean, we heard from the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday saying the United States had acted, quote, preemptively because Israel was going to attack Iran anyway, and then Iran would have attacked US interests once Israel struck. What do you make of that line of argument?
I can't speak to what was happening behind closed doors. I don't have the access that I used to, but it was clear that the U.S. military was preparing for something this large. So I don't think that they were caught off guard, and I don't think they got pulled into the conflict at the last minute because of the forces that they postured in advance. Unlike last year when the 12-day war happened, the U.S. military almost doubled the amount of air power it brought in, had significantly more ships, destroyers, had a second aircraft carrier. And so they were prepared to do a lot more than they had in the past. I think that's a good indicator that they weren't pulled in at the last minute, but that they had something in mind of the scale.
And now that Iran has targeted the US embassy, for example, in Riyadh, and President Trump is warning on that front of massive retaliation. I mean, what sort of options do you think he has in mind?
Right now, it's going to be wide-scale bombing across Iran to go after as many of those targets as I had mentioned. Whether they go further than that, I don't know. I mean, there are other options that they have at their disposal. They may be looking at Karg Island and potential to control it. I know that's been discussed in years past. That's where most of Iran's oil flows through. I think 80 to 90% of Iran's oil goes to that island and then is shipped onward to other destinations. They may be looking at heavier bombing campaign around Tehran as they look at the security forces that are there and some of the forces that were used to suppress protesters. So I think we're still in for 2 or 3 more weeks of military bombing and movements by the Trump administration as they continue to try and degrade the military as much as possible.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about your anticipated timeline, because President Trump has been talking about this 4 to 5 week timeline. He's also been saying the US has stockpiles to fight, quote, forever. I mean, what clues have you been listening out for, and how have you deduced that we're looking at sort of 2 to 3 weeks here?
The sheer size of the military force that was brought in is a good signal that they're prepared to fight for a long time. My 2 to 3 week assessment was based a lot on the public statements that are coming out of the White House, the military posture that's there. But obviously that could change easily as the threat from Iranian forces changes. I think right now the U.S. military is seeing a lot more retaliation against the Gulf states than it had expected. Iran has the capability to draw on a lot of the drone reserves that they have, and they have workshops across Iran to create new drones and send them to the battlefield. And that's going to be very hard for the U.S. military to go after. There's going to be a bit of a cat and mouse game with a lot of the Iranian forces in secluded areas producing drones and then sending them to the front line to use against Gulf states and ships or other targets.
And that's going to be hard to track down because it's not very large scale. They're in remote areas. They've hidden that program. What makes that difficult for the US to target that drone program?
It's difficult because it's highly dispersed across the country. Iran is a very large country, and they're hidden in a lot of places across the country underground. And so I think typically what happens in Iran, and this is similar to Yemen and other parts of the Middle East, where you can dig pretty deep into the ground, put together a facility that's undetected by satellite images or others, and then pull out the weapons that you have and move them down the road undetected and use them 40 minutes away or 2 hours away by drive. So that is a difficult environment for the U.S. military to figure out where everything's moving and where it's coming from.
Okay, I mean, how do you see this war ending? And do you think it's still far too early to be thinking about any off-ramps? I mean, is there even the desire on either side for an off-ramp yet?
Off-ramps are possible at any time. One thing that President Trump has shown is that he's willing to change course pretty rapidly based on the environment and the opportunities that might pop up. So that's certainly possible. If I were to game it out, I would say right now we're in a war of attrition of resources on both sides that's happening rapidly. I think on the Iranian side, they are quickly running low on their long-range and short-range ballistic missiles, and they're having to turn to lower-cost drones. And so the nature of war and the threat there is changing day to day based on what they're going to be using. And then getting the drones to the front line as they're being targeted will be difficult too. So I think the tempo is going to drop in the next week or two, but we'll still see opportunistic attacks against Gulf countries, against passing ships. And they'll be less frequent, but still happening. On the U.S. side, there's also a resource attrition that's happening. A lot of the munitions that the U.S. has to defend the bases and the ships that are there, as well as embassies and other sensitive targets in the Gulf states, those are also being depleted quickly, and the U.S. is going to have to bring in reinforcements. And that takes time because a lot of those interceptors that they use are quite large, and bringing in reinforcements in the middle of a conflict zone in an urban area or in an area with a lot of civilians can be very challenging. And so with both sides running short on the munitions that they have, I think we'll see the tempo drop, but the threat still there in many countries around Iran.
Okay, and do you think when you hear Pete Hegseth stating his missions, his goals, destroy the missile threat, destroy the Navy, no nukes, I mean, can all of that be achieved from the air and without boots on the ground?
It's very challenging. I think they can degrade the capabilities significantly, and they already have. I mean, their number one stated objectives were, one, eliminating the nuclear threat, and we've already seen some evidence that they've destroyed some of the facilities that had been identified before. And the second was to destroy the ballistic missile production facilities. I don't know the status of all of those, but I'm sure that they're striking those with each day that passes. I think the next big question is whether the Trump administration is eager to have more control over the oil sector and do something similar to what they did in Venezuela, where they benefited from having access to the oil reserves. And then the second biggest question is whether the Trump administration will stop short of a regime change or some sort of effort to put a new government in place that doesn't include the IRGC or includes IRGC members that are more U.S. friendly. I'm not saying that that's a good idea or that I support it in any way, but in talking about what I am anticipating the Trump objectives might be, I think that's something to keep in mind.
Just drawing on your experience as Situation Room manager there at the White House, I mean, can we assume that President Trump is watching a lot of what's happening on the battlefield in real time? Is that something that the president would typically be doing in a situation like this?
No doubt. I've advised multiple presidents at the White House, Republican and Democrat, and they have the capabilities to get regular briefings wherever they are on what's happening on the battlefield. So I would expect he's getting routine briefings and a picture of what the battlefield looks like across Iran. In my past experience, when I was serving the president during conflicts like this, it wouldn't be unusual for the president to receive briefings every few hours on what's happening, and that we have a lot of mobile capabilities so that we can bring that to the president in a secure fashion wherever he is.
Okay, and just drawing on your experience as well with regards to the Situation Room, I mean, why do you think President Trump chose to do a televised address from the Oval Office? Isn't that something that presidents typically do in situations like this?
I think he wanted to project power and show the American people the importance of the operation. I think that that's been Trump's pattern since the beginning of the administration, where whenever there is an operation like this or something that he wants to take ownership of and show that he's leading on, he does an Oval address. So I wasn't surprised by that. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more in the weeks ahead.
And obviously this is an important year for the president and for the GOP. We've got the midterms in November. I mean, how politically risky is this operation, given that President Trump didn't get congressional approval before it, and given that it seems the vast majority of Americans are not in favor of any more wars in faraway lands?
It's extremely risky, not just for American forces in the region and American interests in the regions or the embassies that are there, but also publicly for the Trump administration. I think it comes with a lot of challenges. And on the eve of this war, I think you had a Republican Party that was warming up to the idea of U.S. intervention in other countries. A year ago, I think there was a more isolationist sentiment within the Republican Party. And after the first bombing of the Fordo nuclear facilities in Iran, and Americans seeing that, and there was reluctance to support that, and then some support for it after it was successful. And then again in Venezuela, where before the operation, a lot of Republicans were against the operation. And then when they saw it as successful in their eyes, they were more supportive of it. And so there was this warming up process that had been happening over the last year, where a lot of Americans in the Republican Party shifted from being more isolationist to being more receptive to interventionist type of policies. And on the eve of the conflict, I think the majority of the Republican voters were receptive to the use of military force in Iran. And that's a big shift over the last year.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, Marc Gustafson. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you for having me.
We're joined now by Ambassador David Hale, former US Special Envoy for Peace in the Middle East under President Barack Obama, and former US Ambassador to Pakistan, Lebanon and Jordan. He joins us from Washington. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador Hale. I'd like to draw on your Lebanon credentials and experience. You served there about a decade ago. We're being told that Israel has been seizing new positions inside southern Lebanon. They're trying to create a buffer zone. There's a slightly depressing sense of déjà vu here, isn't there? I mean, what's the point of that buffer zone, do you think?
Well, part of it's déjà vu, but part of it also, there's been a fundamental shift within Lebanon. The Israelis obviously want to defend their country. They thought they had a ceasefire. They thought they had an agreement that the Lebanese army would sort of disarm Hezbollah on a permanent basis. The army made some strides in South Lebanon, but it wasn't enough to prevent Hezbollah from rather mindlessly joining in this round of the war. So the Israelis are taking matters into their own hands. I would hope that they have learned lessons from the past about the unexpected consequences, unintended consequences of a long-term occupation. But there's been fundamental change in Lebanon. I've been going back, even though I was ambassador there a decade ago, I've been going back quite frequently. And the mood has shifted dramatically against Hezbollah, including within their own community of the Shia Muslims of Lebanon. They are frustrated and disgusted, by all accounts, with what has happened here. And you saw that in the cabinet decision, which was unanimously endorsed, including by Shia ministers, basically condemning Hezbollah and banning its use of arms.
Right. I mean, they were banned by the Prime Minister yesterday in that declaration. Their military activities are banned. But can those words be backed up in any way? I mean, does the Lebanese army have the wherewithal to take on Hezbollah?
They're going to proceed cautiously and carefully. I don't think the army commander wants to have any mistakes occur. But I also understand informally that there is a sense that the political cover now exists that may not have existed before to proceed more forcefully and more promptly in areas north of the southern sector. They call it the South Litani sector, the 15 kilometers closest to Israel. Now the challenge is preserving that, keeping the soldiers down there that need to be keep it stable once this situation stabilizes, and then proceed northward.
Okay, I mean, Israel says it struck more than 160 Hezbollah targets across southern Lebanon during the last couple of days. I mean, Israel might argue that they're doing what the Lebanese government was supposed to do. Why has the Lebanese government not been able to root out Hezbollah fully?
I think there's there are manpower limitations, so there is a need to go step by step. I think that's how the army would describe the situation. But the real issue in my mind is the political cover, as I mentioned. Wanting to avoid, you talked about déjà vu, one of the things that many Lebanese are very sensitive to is not inciting another civil conflict. And so they want to proceed in a way that enhances the authority of the state, but does not create a counter reaction amongst the Shia population that has historically been supportive of Hezbollah. That support seems to have evaporated. So I think now that there's a much clearer course ahead for the army, and hopefully they can do it so the Israelis will feel confident that they themselves do not have to do what the state of Lebanon has for decades failed to do.
Okay, just turning our eye to Iran now. I mean, we're on day 4. I'd like to get your position on this conflict, whether you support it, and also ask you what you think has been achieved during these 4 days.
Well, in some ways, there's a debate in the United States about the urgency of the threat, the imminent nature of the threat. Why now? Was there sufficient public communication? And politicians will be debating those issues. To me, this was all one continuous war that started on October 7th, and that Iran joined quite rapidly if it had not been behind it in the first place. And so there were efforts to get negotiations going, which we don't have the details about, but it's obvious that the Trump administration felt that they were being basically diddled with by the Iranians, that they were not serious in these negotiations, and that the time had come to finally put an end to what had been decades, frankly, of Iranian intimidation, threats, and spewing of violence around the region. And so whatever the outcome of this war is, in terms of political changes, regimes, and so forth, definitely there will be a major setback for Iran's ability to threaten the neighborhood.
I mean, the Trump administration seems to be counting on a sizable percentage of Iran's 90 million strong population or thereabouts rising up against, 47 years of theocratic rule. What do you think the chances are of that happening, of those people taking to the streets and somehow bringing about meaningful change?
Well, I would be cautious about building a strategy on assumptions of what's going to happen inside Iran when we're not there and don't really have fully accurate information of what's going on, or the ability to actually make a difference at the ground level as opposed to air assaults. I do think that there is a groundswell of opposition to the regime, anger. We saw it in January. We've seen it before. The problem is that the regime is capable of being quite ruthless in slaughtering anyone who raises their head in protest. And so these protesters are unarmed. They're not particularly well organized. And it would take leadership and organization to really, I think, have an impact on the politics. What's more interesting to me right now is what may happen within the regime. So not so much regime change, but a change within the way the regime is structured and what their agendas are. I think that post-Khamenei, we don't know what the succession is going to look like, but we know what the methods are. The clerical establishment comes together and chooses from amongst themselves, but that likely is not going to produce a leader that has the legitimacy and authority that we saw of Khamenei I think the IRGC is going to go through a period of factional struggle. And the outcome may be a more pragmatic leadership, not necessarily one we would want to choose, but maybe one that we could at least deal with.
Okay, so less of a change of regime, more of perhaps a modification of the regime. Is that sort of where you see potentially things heading?
Yeah, I see that as a more likely scenario. Obviously, we would all love to see popular will expressed through protests and ultimately freedom to control their own government. But Iran has not experienced that in quite a long time, if ever in its history. And I just frankly don't quite see the pieces coming together, at least in the short term. But in the long term, there may be cracks in the security establishment of this regime that oppositionists could exploit. There are also, ethnic divisions in the country that have to be borne in mind. There's a large Azeri population, there's a Kurdish population, there are Arab tribes in the southwest, and they must all be looking and calculating. But again, as far as I know, none of them are particularly well organized, perhaps with the exception of the Kurds, to seize this opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, in the absence of an obvious and organized opposition movement and figureheads, apart from the son of the late Shah, Reza Pahlavi, I mean, without that sort of infrastructure or that vehicle for people to jump on, I mean, it's going to be very difficult, isn't it, to bring about a wholesale change in the leadership there in Iran?
Absolutely, particularly since, the regime still has a monopoly on oppression. And, unlike the Shah, who he and his establishment sort of lost their heart, and that was part of the reason that they collapsed in face of the revolution, this regime still seems to be pretty united and pretty determined to use weapons against any threat internally. Now, we may be eliminating much of that threat through our military action, so that will be something to watch and see how that changes the equation.
Now, I know a lot of commentators, a lot of experts do not like drawing comparisons between Iran and Venezuela. But the model that was used in Venezuela, i.e. working with elements of the previous leadership, seems to have worked quite well. And it's obviously a less risky, less expensive way of going about a change of direction of a country, and obviously results in much less bloodletting. Do you see that being something potentially that the Trump administration opts for in the case of Iran?
Yes, I mean, that was what I was trying to get at in your earlier question, really, is that we may see a change in the regime. So they're still oppressive, unfortunately. They may still be not particularly friendly toward the United States, but not the kind of hostile, ideologically motivated clerical regime that we're dealing with today, and one that is not going to be, as I said, spewing violence, trying to dominate the region through force that we have seen this revolutionary regime doing since 1979.
And Ambassador Hale, do you think it's still too early to be thinking about ceasefires, off-ramps, or do you think perhaps there is a bit of quiet regional mediation already taking place?
I have no doubt that there are back channels being used. How meaningful they are is impossible for me to judge. I don't think the United States is going to back off. I think the shortest timetable we've heard from the president is 2 weeks. He's now talking a bit longer. I think the desire now, and probably this was what my guess is, the consultations with Prime Minister Netanyahu and with some of the Arab leaders wasn't the question about whether to do it, but whether to do it right. In other words, to not do a half-measured operation, but really, really end Iran's ability to threaten the neighborhood. And so I think the United States is on that path. And I also think that right now, probably the Iranian regime itself is so disorganized that it would not be able to find enough unity of purpose within its own ranks to take any course of action other than the status quo.
Disorganized and compromised, it would appear, because, I mean, in the last 18 months, really, it's become apparent that Israel has seriously compromised the powers that be in Iran and is able to track them with considerable ease. There's even a report out today that Israel hacked the traffic cameras in Iran and was therefore able to keep track of where everybody was. I mean, with that sort of precise knowledge of where the powers that be are and what their movements are, I mean, clearly they're extremely vulnerable. We've already seen that. I mean, they've already taken out the supreme leader. And do you think it's just a matter of time before, more senior figures are killed?
Yes, I think that's part of the strategy here. And just before we started, saw news that there had been an attack on the headquarters of what do they call the Assembly of Experts, which is the body of clerics that determines the succession to the spiritual leader. So, yeah, this is clearly front and center, part of the strategy, particularly the early phase, to decapitate this bloodthirsty regime and then deal with the military elements that the Iranians would be using to retaliate. So we've had a period where some Iranian drones and missiles have gotten through, not that many, despite the dramatic pictures we see, and that may start to be reduced even further.
And how's this going down in the United States, in Washington, where you are? I mean, President Trump didn't run this by Congress. He hasn't made that classic address to the nation from the Oval Office that, we have grown used to seeing in previous situations. How's this panning out for him, do you think, domestically?
Right. Well, it's classic Trump unconventionality, and he's also established the fact that, let me rephrase this, he has enunciated goals that can easily be shifted. And that's one of the criticisms being laid. But of course, he can declare victory almost at any point here and say, I got what I wanted. In Washington, there's no groundswell of opposition, but there isn't, nor is there a groundswell of support. Early opinion polling, which I think is probably of limited use so early in this campaign, but shows that only 27% of the American public actually supports this war. But I think that's personally, and I'm not an expert on our own politics, but I think it's more indicative of confusion because of the unusual way in which this whole campaign was unfolded publicly, confusion about what our objectives are. And part of the confusion, I think, is deliberate by the administration, not to confuse the American people, but to make sure that the Iranian regime can't figure out from what we're saying publicly what our next military move is, and to keep a certain level of creative and strategic ambiguity. Of course, you have to balance that against our democratic need to ensure that the American people have bought into this through our different means that we have. Politically, obviously, the Republicans are either supportive or not criticizing, although there is an element of the president's own base that is puzzled by the fact that he had talked about no more freedom agendas, no more interference in foreign governments, and yet here he is talking about just that in Iran. And then, of course, you have the Democrats who will, it's a political year, we have midterm elections, they're going to do their utmost to portray this as negatively as possible. The main point, though, is success breeds success. And so far, this has been a highly successful campaign.
Right. And if that continues, if the stated goals are achieved, your final thoughts, I mean, this will play out well, won't it, for President Trump and the GOP in the midterms in November?
If casualties are kept to a minimum, if we don't get into a ground offensive, if we don't get too hung up on the political domestic arrangements in Iran, and Iran is put in the turning of the tables on Iran's ability to export violence is straightforward. Yes, this is a major victory for the United States. We have been trying to deal with Iran for over 40 years. No president has succeeded. So we'll see if this approach works.
We're going to have to leave it there. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Ambassador David Hale, thank you very much indeed, sir.
Thank you.
Now, the US Secretary of State Pete Hegseth has criticized traditional allies, accusing them of, quote, pearl clutching and imposing, quote, stupid rules of engagement. He made those comments as he defended the joint US-Israeli strikes on Iran, which have escalated tensions across the region.
Capable partners, as we've said since the beginning, capable partners are good partners. Unlike so many of our traditional allies who wring their hands and clutch their pearls, hemming and hawing about the use of force. America, regardless of what so-called international institutions say, is unleashing the most lethal and precise air power campaign in history. B-2s, fighters, drones, missiles, and of course, classified effects. All on our terms, with maximum authorities. No stupid rules of engagement, no nation-building quagmire, no democracy-building exercise, no politically correct wars. We fight to win, and we don't waste time.
We're joined now by Sir Liam Fox, who is a former UK Defence Secretary. He joins us from London. Sir Liam, thank you very much indeed for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya English. The US President Donald Trump has been speaking to the British newspapers, and he said that the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has not been at all helpful. And he says the US-UK relationship is not like it used to be. I assume this is about the US-Israeli strikes principally. Is that all that it's about?
Yes, I think so. I think it represents some short-term irritation about the British government's unwillingness to allow the US access to British bases in the early part of this campaign. Of course, I think that all changed when there were drone attacks on the British base in Cyprus. I hope that we can now concentrate on the job at hand and not on the divisions that we have, but on our common goal, which is to ensure that we have an Iran that is safe for the people of Iran, for its immediate neighbours and the rest of the world.
So it sounds as though you think President Trump is doing the right thing by attacking Iran.
Well, it's very clear that Iran posed a real danger to its neighbours and to the wider region and the wider world. It's not like Iraq, where we were told that there were going to be weapons of mass destruction. We know Iran is trying to get a nuclear weapon. All the evidence points to that. We know that Iran will use proxies to carry out terrorist activities in the region and beyond. We know that Iran will murder its own citizens to try to keep the regime in place. So it clearly is a real threat to not just countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, but all our interests in the region, including our friends and allies in the UAE.
I mean, the British Prime Minister has suggested that there is not a legal basis for this conflict and there isn't a clear plan. I mean, do you see where he's coming from with his cautious approach?
Well, I think there is a very clear reason, given that Iran has used its proxies to damage our interests. We've had the Houthis firing on the Royal Navy in the Red Sea. We've had Hezbollah and Hamas attacking Israel, one of our close allies, including putting our own citizens in those countries at risk. And we've seen drones fired now directly at a UK base in Cyprus. What more legal reason do you need?
And as for the strategy side of things, Prime Minister Starmer and others in his cabinet are saying, we do not believe in regime change from the skies. I mean, what they seem to be saying is, without boots on the ground, you can't achieve all of the things you're setting out to achieve, i.e., sweeping change in Iran and its leadership. I mean, do you agree with that?
Well, I think there's a confusion in that very statement. To say we don't believe in regime change from the skies, does that mean you do believe in regime change by other means? If so, what are they? It's very clear that there is a huge amount of popular unrest with the regime in Tehran. This is a vicious, toxic, theocratic regime that really doesn't have a place in the 21st century. We've now got a whole generation of young people who've grown up under the tyranny of the Ayatollahs, who want to see the same freedoms that are enjoyed elsewhere. They see the prosperity in the rest of the region, never mind the rest of the world, and want to share in that. And I don't think that anyone would shed a tear to see the toppling of a regime that has become increasingly paranoid, increasingly vicious, and increasingly aggressive towards its neighbours.
And yet, this overture has been made more than once to the Iranian people to, essentially, it's over to you and seize the moment. And we haven't seen people come out onto the streets in Iran. Why do you think that is?
I think, well, if you have lived under the tyranny of the IRGC, the Basij, and the other elements of the Iranian security forces, of course you're going to be very cautious. especially when you've seen tens of thousands of your friends, family, and fellow citizens murdered by the regime in the early months of 2026. I think there's a very important message that needs to go out, and it needs to go out from all of us who want to see a different Iran. And that's a message to all those who are part of the security apparatus in Iran. And it says, which side are you on? Are you on the side of a broken, failing, dying regime that oppresses its people? Or are you on the side of a free Iran and a free Iranian people? How you behave in the coming hours and days will be judged by the international community. You will be held accountable for your actions. And it's never too late to change sides. It's never too late to join the cause of a free Iran. And we should be making that case to these people all the time, because in many ways they hold the key to how easy or difficult it would be to get a different country with the people of Iran choosing who governs them, rather than a small, self-selecting, theocratic bunch of murderers.
But do you think the problem with the second option, i.e. the free Iran option, is that it's still abstract for a lot of Iranian people? There isn't an obvious opposition or figure for them to rally around, apart from Reza Pahlavi, and not everyone who doesn't support the theocratic regime supports Reza Pahlavi. Do you think more should have been done, perhaps to lay the groundwork for people in Iran to have something or someone to rally around?
I think your point is 100% correct. I think if you think back to 1979, the revolution against the Shah and his autocratic rule was a wide revolution. It included nationalists, Marxists, secular liberals, religious figures. It was broad-based. That regime was hijacked, that revolution was hijacked by Ayatollah Khomeini and his people, who were better organized than the others. We do need to see some concept of a fragmented opposition coming together to be able to provide some kind of interim solution should the regime fall. It's difficult to see how, with a fragmented opposition like this, you could move to a single settled system. So there needs to be discussions between these groups, between the Shah's son, between the MEK. Some of the principles, I think, have been well set out, that of the basis on which Iran should proceed, but it requires a lot of people who have a lot of grudges against one another to come together and recognize that the cause that they support together is much greater than the differences they have with one another. That will be key to whether Iran can move from the dreadful governance that it's had so far into something much more optimistic for the future. And I think that everybody who has any influence with any of these different groups needs to encourage them now to come together, agree on what that path is for the future, and to put their past differences behind them, recognizing that the prize of a free Iran is such a great one for the Iranian people, as well as the rest of the region and the rest of the world.
Before we reach this point, in the last 10 days or so, Iran and Russia conducted joint military exercises just off the Strait of Hormuz. And I'm just wondering, having seen Russia lose two other allies, essentially in the last 18 months, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, are the Russians going to allow a third ally, i.e. the regime in Iran, to fall without perhaps some effort to rescue them?
Well, they let their allies in Syria fall without any effort, largely because they don't have any effort to spare. They're spending so much of their military prowess in the illegal and barbaric oppression of Ukraine. They don't really have much in terms of spare assets to give anyone else. I think the Iranians can expect just about as much help as President Assad got in Syria from Vladimir Putin. What
about China?
Well, China, I don't think, is going to be particularly pleased with the Iranians, given that so much of their LNG comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and they're so dependent on oil moving there too. So what Iran are doing is Not only have they united the region against themselves by their absolutely unwarranted acts of terror in Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, but they're now setting out, it seems, to alienate one of the countries that has been their ally, i.e. China. And I don't imagine that the regime in Beijing is particularly pleased at the behavior of the IRGC and the remnants of the regime at the present time.
Just staying with Russia for one moment, and we'll move on to something else. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has a line of argument which goes roughly like this. Countries in the region, i.e. the Middle East, are going to work like never before to acquire a nuclear weapon, working on the basis that the US doesn't attack countries that have nuclear bombs. Do you think he's got a point that we are going to see some sort of an arms race or a new nuclear arms race in the Middle East as a result of this?
Quite the opposite. The arms race in the Middle East would have happened if Iran had developed a viable nuclear weapon and the means of delivering it. I'm afraid that on this, as in most things, Lavrov is wrong.
Okay. One of the things that's quite striking, I mean, lots of headlines to draw and hard to know which ones to pick, but the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth in the United States, saying, quote, "This is no democracy-building exercise. There'll be no stupid rules of engagement." What do you read into that?
That this is primarily about the removal of risk, that it's a mission to ensure that the Iranian regime not only doesn't have the nuclear weapons to threaten countries like Israel, and remember former presidents saying that they would wipe Israel off the map, but we've seen the very toxic way in which Iran has used its influence, its proxies, Hezbollah in particular, but also Hamas and the Houthis. They are a persistent threat to not just United States interests, but the interests of our allies in the region. One of the reasons why there was such support for the Abraham Accords was the recognition that that these countries in the region, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, for example, all wanted a very different future from the one that Iran wanted to see. I think that, ironically, that what has happened and Iran's reckless and dangerous and vicious attacks on its neighbors will bring these countries closer together. It's exactly what Iran didn't want to see.
Just looking back, I mean, a week ago when perhaps President Trump was deciding what his next move should be, I mean, having deployed all of that military material to the region, the aircraft carriers, one has been in position for a while now, but one is only just arriving in the region now. I mean, was doing nothing ever an option, do you think, for President Trump? Could he really have turned all that equipment around back to the United States without having achieved some massive concessions from the Iranians?
Well, it was all about getting Iran to come to a sensible and verifiable result relating to their nuclear program, and I imagine the use of their proxies against American and other interests. Iran has been playing for time. That is classically what they do. I think there was a realization on the part of the United States and certainly on the part of Israel that they could only put up with this for so long, because all the time that they were stalling talks, they were almost certainly trying to restart their nuclear program. And I think that the patience of the rest of the world could only be stretched so far.
Now, I know it's only day 4, but, you know, there's a lot of people asking how long this is going to go on for. I mean, President Trump has slightly shifted the goalposts. He's now talking about this lasting 4 to 5 weeks. I mean, what sort of a time frame do you think we might be looking at here?
I think it's impossible to say. And if anyone who thinks they know they're just making guesses at this point, unless you're able to see the intelligence about the degree by which the regime has been debilitated. We have to remember that we have a theocracy and an extreme and barbaric theocracy sitting on top of a well-oiled what I call a thugocracy. Basically the IRGC, the Quds Force and the Basij. And they have such a large control over the means of production in Iran, that they will not give up their material gains unless they are given guarantees about a different alternative, which is why I say again that they are key to what happens in the near future. They need to choose which side they're on, and I hope and pray that they choose the side of a free Iran and a peaceful coexistence in the whole of the region. That is in everybody's interests.
And just to wrap up this conversation, Salim, were you to advise the current British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, on how to proceed and how to mend fences with Washington, what would you suggest he did or said?
I would suggest he had a general election and made way for a government that was better able to promote Britain's national interests.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Salim Fox, former UK Defence
Always a pleasure.
Secretary.
Thank you.
Thank you. That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Do join us again tomorrow for some more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.